My name is Lydia Holt. I'm 31 years old, and I've spent the last 9 years working as a nurse in the cardiac intensive care unit at a level 1 trauma center in Philadelphia. I don't say that to impress anyone. Most people hear nurse and picture someone handing out pills and taking temperatures. That's fine. I stopped correcting people a long time ago. But last Saturday, at my father's retirement dinner, the Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery at the most prestigious hospital in the state turned to my father and said, quietly but clearly enough for the table to hear, "Sir, do you know what your daughter did?" My father's face went the color of old chalk. He hadn't known. That was the point. He never asked. I want to tell you how we got there. My father retired after 32 years as a physician. Orthopedic surgery. His walls at home are covered in plaques. His shelves have more framed letters from hospital boards and medical associations than they have family photos. He built his career on precision, on the idea that medicine was a system, and that every person in that system had a defined role. Surgeons at the top, everyone else arranged beneath them in descending order of importance. Nurses were near the bottom of that arrangement. He never said it like that. He was too smart, too polished. But it was in the way he said "just a nurse." When people asked what I did, the pause before "just" that lasted exactly long enough to do the work he needed it to do. It was in the way he changed the subject at dinner when I mentioned a patient I'd lost, as though grief without a surgical instrument in your hand was somehow amateur. The first time he said it out loud, I was 24. I had just finished my first year on the CICU floor, and I came home for Thanksgiving still running on 3 hours of sleep, and the kind of exhaustion that sits behind your eyes. He was holding court at the dinner table, his colleagues and their spouses listening to a story about a particularly complex valve repair he performed. He was good at stories. He always had been. Someone at the table asked about me. He smiled. The exact same smile he gave strangers who complimented his car. "Lydia's in nursing," he said, "still figuring out what she wants to do with her life." I was sitting 6 feet away from him. I put my fork down. I didn't say anything. What was the point? He wasn't asking to understand. He was reminding me of where I stood in his accounting of things. I drove back to Philadelphia that night. I called my friend Reyes from the parking lot of a rest stop on I-95 and told him what happened, and he said, "Lyd, you know what you are. He just doesn't." And I knew Reyes was right. I knew it. But knowing something and not feeling it at the same time is its own kind of exhaustion. So I stopped trying to explain myself to my father. I stopped bringing up patients, stopped mentioning difficult shifts, stopped hoping he'd ask a follow-up question. I let him have his version of me, the one still figuring it out, and I went back to work. What he didn't know, what he never thought to ask about, was what that work actually looked like. In the CICU, you are the last thing standing between a patient and the end. Surgeons open the chest and close it. Nurses live in the hours and days between. We are the ones at 3 in the morning when the blood pressure drops and the attending is 45 minutes away and someone has to decide in the next 90 seconds. I have held a man's heart rate together with medication adjustments and positioning changes in sheer attention for 6 hours while waiting on a transfer team. I have sat with a woman at 4 in the morning while she told me the name of her granddaughter because she needed someone to know it before she stopped being able to say it. I have done compressions until my arms gave out, and I have called time of death, and I have walked back to the nurse's station and started charting because someone else needed me in 10 minutes. My father performed surgery with a team of 10 people supporting him. I performed different kinds of miracles with a badge, a stethoscope, and the ability to read a monitor faster than most people read a text message. None of that was in his accounting. The phone call came on a Thursday in early September, 8 months before the retirement dinner. He didn't say hello first. That was always how I knew it was him. "The hospital is throwing me a dinner," he said. "End of January. I've already told them you'd say a few words." I let the silence go a beat. "You told them?" "It's just a toast, Lydia, nothing formal. 5 minutes. You'll be fine." I asked which hospital. He told me, Memorial Physician Center. The system where he had built his entire career, where half the department heads still called him by his last name like it was a title. A 600-person black tie event in the grand ballroom of the Bellevue, the kind of night where the governor showed up for 30 minutes and called it an honor. "Wear something appropriate," he said before hanging up. Not, "Would you like to?" Not, "Is that okay?" Just, "Wear something appropriate." I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after the call ended, and then I thought, all right, fine, because here is something my father never understood about me. I am not soft. I was trained in a building where being soft gets people killed. I know how to hold something for a very long time and wait for exactly the right moment. And I had been holding this particular thing for 7 years. He thought he was giving me a microphone for his night. He had no idea what I was about to say into it. I need to go back to the summer I was 26, because that's where the story actually begins. Her name was Dr. Nora Vance. She was the chief resident in cardiothoracic surgery at the time, on call the night a 63-year-old man named Arthur came into our unit in full cardiogenic shock following an emergency cab bishi that had gone sideways in the OR. I won't bore you with the clinical details. What matters is that Arthur arrived to my floor at 11:47 at night, freshly closed, a time bomb. The surgical team had handed him off and gone to other cases. His attending was reachable by phone. Residents were stretched across 2 floors. I was his nurse. By 12:30, I knew something was wrong that wasn't on the chart. His mixed venous oxygen wasn't tracking right. His pressure was holding, but barely, and in a way that felt borrowed rather than real. I paged the covering resident. I paged again. I called the attending, who told me to watch it and call back in an hour. I kept watching. I kept adjusting. I documented everything every 15 minutes, because I knew how these nights ended, and I knew the only way to prove what happened was to have written it down before it happened. At 1:44 in the morning, Arthur's pressure crashed. I had already pushed the crash cart to his door 20 minutes before, because I had learned to trust the feeling in my chest before the alarms caught up to it. I called a rapid response. I started running the code before the resident arrived. When Dr. Vance came through the door 4 minutes later, her hair still up from the OR, dried sweat on her scrubs, I handed her a complete picture. Vitals trending since admission. Medication adjustments. My assessment of what was happening and what we needed to do in the next 3 minutes. She looked at me for half a second and said, "You already called it." "Yes, ma'am." We worked for 47 minutes. Arthur made it. Afterward, Dr. Vance found me at the nurse's station. She sat down in the chair across from me, which attending physicians did not do, as a rule, and she said, "How long have you been watching him?" I told her, since he arrived. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to remember your name." I thanked her. I went back to charting. I ate a granola bar in the break room at 3:15 and thought about Arthur's wife, who was asleep in the family waiting room down the hall, and whether she knew how close the night had come. Dr. Vance became Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery 14 months later. I moved to a different unit for 2 years, then came back. We had not spoken again. She probably didn't remember. There are a lot of nurses in a hospital system this size, and chiefs have 1,000 things pulling at them at once. I had no expectation. I hadn't saved Arthur for her to remember. I'd done it because it was my job and because he had a wife in the waiting room and because sometimes that is enough reason. But the night of the retirement dinner, I found out she had remembered everything. The Bellevue was exactly what you'd expect for this kind of evening. Chandeliers, open bar, surgical department brass and black tie laughing at jokes they'd told 20 times. My father circulated the room like he was orbiting his own gravity, comfortable in a way I'd only ever seen him be in spaces where he was clearly the most important person in it. He introduced me twice in the first hour. Both times, my daughter Lydia, she's a nurse at Penn, said with the specific warmth of a man acknowledging something slightly embarrassing with good grace. The third time, I was standing right next to him. He did it again. The pause, the subject change. I smiled at the couple across from us, excused myself, and went to find a glass of water. I stood near the back of the room for a few minutes watching the crowd, and that's when I saw her. Dr. Vance was near the bar, speaking with two department chairs. She was wearing a dark green dress and had her hair down for once, and I almost didn't recognize her out of scrubs, but I knew the posture. Economy of movement. Never anything wasted. The same way she'd walked into Arthur's room that night. I was not going to approach her. It wasn't why I was there, but she looked up, across the room, and found my face. And I watched her go still for just a moment. The same half-second pause she'd done in Arthur's room 5 years ago, calculating. Then she gave me a small nod. The kind that means, I see you, I remember. I nodded back. The dinner was at 8. My father gave his remarks first. 32 years, a standing ovation, 3 video tributes from colleagues around the country. He was good. He'd always been good in rooms like this. He received the applause like he'd been practicing for it his whole life. Then they introduced me. I walked to the podium. I had notes in my pocket that I had written and rewritten 6 times. But when I got up there, with 600 people looking at me and my father smiling from his seat at the center table, I folded the notes back up. I looked out at the room. I said, my father taught me something very early about medicine. He said that every person in a hospital has a role, and that the integrity of the system depends on everyone understanding their place in it. He said that very sincerely, and I believe he meant it. What I also believe is that he spent 32 years not entirely understanding what that meant for the people below him in the arrangement. The room shifted. Imperceptible at first. Silverware going quiet. I kept going. I am a cardiac ICU nurse. I have been for 9 years. I work nights. I work weekends. I worked Christmas Eve last year and New Year's morning and a Sunday after Mother's Day, and I would not change any of it because on those shifts there was always someone who needed exactly what I could give them. My father's smile was still in place, but something behind it had changed. 5 years ago, a post-surgical patient came to my floor in the middle of the night. His attending was available by phone. His resident was stretched thin. He was my patient. I watched him for 2 hours before his pressure crashed because I had learned to trust what my body knew before the monitors caught up to it. I called the code. I ran it. When the surgeon arrived, I handed her a complete picture. We saved him. Silence, now. Real silence. I never told my father about that night. Not because it wasn't worth telling, but because I already knew what the pause before just sounded like, and I didn't want to hear it applied to the best thing I'd ever done. Someone in the back of the room set down a glass. I'm not up here to embarrass anyone. I'm up here because he gave me a microphone, and for 9 years I have known exactly what I would say into it if I ever got one. I stopped. I looked at my father. He was very still. His jaw was set. His shoulders rigid, the specific posture of a man who has been caught in a room full of people and is calculating the cost. I raised my glass. To my father. 32 years of excellent surgery, and to every nurse who kept his patients alive on the nights when the surgery wasn't enough on its own. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then Dr. Vance stood up. She was across the room from me at a table near the center, and she rose slowly, the way people rise when they mean it. She lifted her glass. And then, one by one, the nurses at the event did the same. The floor nurses who had been invited as part of the hospital staff contingent. The charge nurses who had worked under my father's service for years. The CICU nurses who recognized the story I was telling even without the names. The surgical attendings stayed seated. Some of them looked at their glasses. Some of them looked at my father. He didn't look at Dr. Vance. He didn't look at me. What happened after the dinner was quieter than I expected. There was no confrontation, no scene. My father moved back into his receiving line and accepted the remaining handshakes, and I found a chair near the wall and waited. Dr. Vance reached me around 9:15. She sat down in the chair beside me, the same way she'd sat across from me at the nurses' station 5 years ago, and she said, "Arthur Cooper is alive. His wife sends a Christmas card to the unit every year. Did you know that?" I shook my head. He asked about you. After, specifically, I looked up who his nurse had been. My throat was tight. I managed. He remembers? He remembers you told him his blood pressure was going to drop and that you were going to fix it before it did. He said it was the most confident thing anyone had ever said to him in a hospital, and it was the last thing he heard before he lost consciousness. She paused. He said it was the reason he wasn't afraid. I didn't cry. I was too tired and too wrung out and too full of 9 years of nights to cry right there in the ballroom. But I felt something release in my chest, some tension that had been living there since the first time my father said, "Just a nurse," and I had absorbed it instead of throwing it back. "You should have been recognized," Dr. Vance said simply. "I put a letter in your file after that night. I want you to know that. It's been there the whole time." I looked at her. "I didn't know that." "I know you didn't." She stood. "I think you do now." The drive home was long. The highway was quiet, the way it gets after midnight when the trucks outnumber the cars. I had the radio off. I was thinking about Arthur's wife sending a Christmas card every year to a unit she'd never see again, to nurses whose names she'd never know, and how that was its own kind of remembrance. How some gratitude lives quietly in envelopes, year after year, waiting for someone to understand what it means. My father called the next morning at 9:10. I let it ring. He left a voicemail. It was 43 seconds long, and in it he said very carefully that he thought my remarks had been somewhat mischaracterized and that the room had perhaps taken them differently than I'd intended. He said we should have lunch. He said it in the tone of a man issuing a correction rather than an apology. I listened to it twice. Then I put the phone down and made coffee and stood at my kitchen window looking at the parking lot below, thinking about the night Arthur's pressure crashed, and the granola bar in the break room at 3:15, and the way Reyes had said he just doesn't present tense, as if it were a temporary condition. I didn't call my father back that morning. I didn't call him that week. What I did was go to work. Monday morning, 12-hour shift. 2 fresh post-surgical patients and 1 transfer from the ED who came in at 6:30 with a potassium number that made me stop and look at it twice. I adjusted. I monitored. I documented every 15 minutes because I had learned to trust what my hands knew before the alarm went off. At the end of the shift, the day nurse who was taking over asked how the night was. "Busy," I said. "Everybody made it." She nodded like that was enough, because in our world it is. 3 weeks after the dinner, I received an email from the hospital's Department of Nursing Excellence. A formal letter attached as a PDF, noting that a senior physician had submitted documentation in support of a clinical excellence nomination for a critical care incident in the summer 5 years prior. The letter said the case had been reviewed and that I had been selected to receive the system's annual Cornerstone Award, the highest recognition given to non-physician clinical staff. I read it 4 times. I forwarded it to Reyes. His response was a single line. Present tense, lid. He just doesn't. I smiled at that. Then I put my phone down and went to the closet and took out a box I hadn't opened in 3 years. Inside, underneath some old textbooks and a spare stethoscope, was a notebook I'd kept during my first year in the CICU. Not a clinical log, a personal one, full of names I didn't want to forget. Patients who hadn't made it. Patients who had. The shifts that changed something in me that couldn't be changed back. Arthur Cooper was on page 12. His wife's name was Donna. I had written it down because he said it twice while I was getting him settled, the way people say names when they're scared and holding on to the things that matter. I hadn't thought about that detail in years. I sat on the floor of my closet with the notebook on my lap for a while. Not crying, just sitting. Letting it be real that someone had been sending a Christmas card every year and I hadn't known, that a woman named Donna had written the same address on an envelope 12 times because she needed somewhere to put her gratitude, and it had gone to a unit where no one connected it to the nurse who made the call. That's the part my father never understood. Not the skill, not the hours, not even the stakes. The part he missed was what it costs a person to live that close to the line between here and gone, night after night, for 9 years, and to still show up the next shift, believing that what you do is the most important thing in the room. He understood surgery. He understood the precision of the instrument and the integrity of the technique and the clarity of a decision made with your hands. He never understood that I made decisions with everything I had, every shift, in the dark alone, with no one watching, for people who might never know my name. Arthur Cooper knew my name. That was enough. It had always been enough. I just hadn't known it until now. The Cornerstone Award ceremony was held on a Wednesday afternoon in the hospital's main conference center. It wasn't a gala. There were no chandeliers or black ties. There was a podium, folding chairs, a table with sandwiches, and about 60 people. Nurses, charge nurses, nursing leadership, a handful of attending physicians. Dr. Vance was there. She sat in the second row. They read the citation. They said the patient's name. They said mine. When I came up to receive it, I didn't have remarks prepared. I hadn't planned on saying anything beyond thank you. But I stood there for a second, looking out at a room full of people who all understood exactly what this kind of work felt like, and I said, I kept a notebook my first year. Names of patients I didn't want to forget. Arthur Cooper is on page 12. I wrote down his wife's name too, because he said it the way people do when they're afraid and holding on to what matters. I didn't know until 3 weeks ago that she's been sending Christmas cards to this unit for 5 years. I want her to know, if somehow this gets back to her, that he was never alone that night. Not for 1 minute. And neither was she. The room was quiet. Then someone started clapping, and it was the kind of clapping that builds slowly because people mean it rather than because they've been cued. I thought about my father's retirement dinner. The 600 people. The standing ovation. The governor shaking his hand for 30 seconds and calling it an honor. I thought about this room. 60 people. Folding chairs, a table with sandwiches. I thought about which night I would remember when I was old. It wasn't a hard answer. I still haven't had that lunch with my father. I don't know if I will or when or what I would say if we sat across from each other and he asked me why. There are some silences that aren't hostile, just necessary. The kind that need to last long enough to mean something before they break. What I know is this. I went to his dinner because he told me to. I said what I said because he gave me a microphone and 9 years of material. And when Dr. Vance stood up and raised her glass, I felt something I hadn't felt in the whole time I'd been doing this work. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter. The sense that I had been heard. Not by the room. Not by my father. Not even entirely by Dr. Vance. By the patients whose names I'd written down in a notebook in my closet. By Arthur, who had said it was the last thing he heard before he lost consciousness, that I was going to fix it before it happened. By Donna, who had addressed that same envelope every December for 5 years to a floor she'd never walk through again. They had heard me long before I had a podium. My father spent 32 years understanding exactly what he was worth. I spent 9 years quietly becoming something he didn't have a word for. And when he finally gave me a stage, expecting background music, I said the part he never expected to hear. The truth doesn't always come in the form of a speech. Sometimes it comes in the form of a blood pressure reading at 1:44 in the morning, and a crash cart you already had at the door, and a name written down on page 12 of a notebook, kept by someone who didn't know yet what it would someday mean to have written it. My name is Lydia Holt. I am 31 years old, and I have never, not once, been just anything. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that night at the Bellevue. Not in any mystical sense, just the plain, observable truth that what you put into the world tends to come back around. Eventually, in a form you didn't expect and couldn't have planned for. My father spent 32 years building a reputation on precision, on the idea that excellence had a shape and that shape looked like his. What he didn't account for was that other people were building things too. Quietly, in rooms he never walked through. On shifts he never worked, for patients he never saw. And that one day all of it would be in the same room at the same time. I didn't go to that dinner looking for justice. I want to be honest about that. I went because he told me to, and because somewhere in me there was still the 24-year-old who had put her fork down at Thanksgiving and absorbed it, still figuring it out like it was a fact about herself rather than a limitation in him. I went because I hadn't yet fully understood that the problem was never my credentials. It was his capacity to see past his own definition of what mattered. What I've come to believe, and this took years, not one dinner, is that integrity is not something you perform for an audience. It's something you practice in the dark. The night I kept Arthur Cooper alive, there were no cameras, no witnesses, no one who would have known if I had made a different call, or waited one more hour, or deferred to someone with more initials after their name. I made the call I made, because I had spent years building the kind of judgment that doesn't need permission. That's not heroism. That's just what it looks like when you take your work seriously enough to do it right, even when no one is watching. And that's the thing about integrity that my father's version of medicine missed. It compounds. Every shift I showed up for, every name I wrote down in that notebook, every 15-minute documentation entry no one would ever read unless something went wrong. All of it was accumulating into something. I didn't know it was accumulating into a letter in my file from Dr. Disson, Vance, or into Arthur's wife addressing the same envelope every December, or into a Cornerstone Award on a Wednesday afternoon with folding chairs and a sandwich table. I was just doing the work. Reyes used to say that the people who dismiss you are usually the ones most afraid of what you're becoming. I think that's partly true. But I also think some people simply never developed the curiosity to look past what confirms what they already believe. My father believed nurses were support staff. Every interaction he had with us confirmed it, because he was only ever looking for confirmation, never information. What I hope, if there's anything worth hoping for in all of this, is that someone watching Lydia Holt give that toast at the Bellevue went home and thought about the nurses on their floor differently. Thought about the person sitting at the monitor at 2 in the morning making the call before the alarm goes off, writing down the name because they don't want anyone to be forgotten. That's the work. That's always been the work. It doesn't need a plaque to be real. It just needs someone to keep doing it. My name is on page 12 of someone else's notebook by now. I hope I've earned it.